Welcome to Podkey Weekly News, where the week's biggest shifts get the shortest, useful briefing. This week, the practical impact is hard to miss. A disaster exposing state failure in Venezuela, Supreme Court rulings that redraw federal power, and AI demand starting to reshape electricity, chips, and infrastructure. In Venezuela, the official earthquake death toll sits somewhere between roughly 1,500 and just under 2,000. But communications blackouts and crowdsourced reporting suggest the real toll could be much higher, with some estimates pushing into 5 digits. The rescue picture is grim. Humanitarian teams say the critical 72-hour survival window closed fast, and while there were late rescues, including one on day 9, the bigger story is how little capacity existed to reach people in time. Residents and aid groups describe a fragmented state response: delayed permissions for aid deliveries, streets closed, soldiers mostly directing traffic, and civilians doing much of the initial digging themselves. Why so many collapses? A lot of the destroyed housing was tied to rushed social housing programs built to hit political targets, with years of corruption, weak code enforcement, engineering shortcuts, and poor materials turning an earthquake into a much bigger human disaster. The immediate watch item is the shift from rescue to reconstruction. UN agencies say hundreds of thousands of children need help and unaccompanied minors face trafficking risks, while outside powers, including the US, are moving in with money, logistics, and influence over rebuilding that could shape Venezuela long after the rubble is cleared. The Supreme Court handed down 2 rulings with very different effects. First, it kept birthright citizenship intact, rejecting President Trump's effort to deny citizenship to most children born on U.S. soil to undocumented or temporary status parents. That matters because it blocks a major executive shortcut. If this issue changes at all, the signal from the opinions is that it would have to come through a more direct political fight in Congress, and public opinion still leans toward keeping birthright citizenship. The second ruling may prove even more consequential inside government. The court sharply expanded presidential power to fire leaders of many independent agencies, weakening long-standing protection for regulators who were supposed to be insulated from day-to-day politics. There was one major carve-out: the Federal Reserve. The court preserved a special protection for Fed governors, which keeps monetary policy more independent even as agencies like the FTC and similar commissions become more exposed to partisan turnover. What to watch next is litigation and personnel churn. Presidents now have a stronger hand in reshaping regulators quickly, and that could affect antitrust, consumer protection, labor, and financial oversight much faster than before. New disclosures and reporting continue to raise conflict questions around Trump's finances, especially around crypto. Depending on the outlet, the numbers vary widely, but the common point is that crypto-linked ventures tied to Trump and his family are producing enormous sums. There's also reporting that about $300 million in 2023 revenue came from Gulf-linked entities, including a major sale tied to a UAE-backed group, which sharpens the foreign influence concern. Add in large media settlement payouts and the use of a Qatar-donated Boeing 747, and the issue is less one transaction than a pattern: unusually open monetization around a sitting president's orbit. The White House says there's no conflict and that assets are handled through institutional trust structures. Critics argue that's nowhere near the separation previous presidents tried to maintain, so expect this to stay a legal, ethical, and political pressure point. AI infrastructure is moving from tech story to industrial story. Hyperscalers are still racing to build compute capacity, but the practical constraint now is power, not just chips. Analysts warn electricity demand tied to AI could jump dramatically by 2030, and these data centers don't draw power smoothly. Their loads spike, which makes grid management harder during heat waves and tight supply periods. That's one reason utility mergers and acquisitions are surging. Companies need capital for generation, transmission, and cooling infrastructure, but regulators are already asking whether consolidation will push costs onto consumers. At the same time, the chip side is splitting into winners and warnings. AI demand has created real DRAM scarcity, boosting memory makers like Micron and helping drive South Korean chip exports higher, with Samsung and SK Hynix central to high bandwidth memory supply. But markets are starting to price in a less simple story. If too much compute gets built too fast, idle GPUs and TPUs could spill into a second-hand market, and firms may start selling excess AI cycles just to improve utilization. So the watch item is whether the AI build-out keeps rewarding physical infrastructure suppliers or starts showing classic overcapacity symptoms in compute and power. On the security side, two risks are converging. Open-weight AI models, including some from China, can be downloaded and modified, which makes export controls harder to enforce and lowers the barrier for offensive cyber use. Meanwhile, researchers keep finding cheap consumer devices like smart frames and streaming boxes being turned into residential proxy botnets. That gives criminal or state actors a large pool of normal-looking traffic for fraud, evasion, and denial of service attacks. The practical takeaway is simple. AI risk policy can't just be about frontier labs. Commodity hardware, open model distribution, and messy real-world cyber abuse are where a lot of near-term damage can happen. Ukraine's long-range drone campaign is still imposing real costs on Russia. Estimates say it has knocked out roughly a quarter to a third of Russian refining capacity, contributing to fuel shortages, rationing, and long lines in multiple regions. That matters because it shows how low-cost mass drone production can pressure strategic infrastructure without relying on expensive missile inventories. Russia's defenses are often better tuned for traditional missile threats than for large swarms. At the same time, Ukraine is still paying heavily on defense. Large Russian missile and drone barrages against Kyiv and other cities are causing civilian deaths and damage to apartment blocks and infrastructure, with Ukrainian officials pointing again to shortages in interceptors and air defense coverage. What to watch is whether Ukraine can scale domestic interceptor and strike drone production fast enough to reduce that gap, because this war is increasingly a manufacturing and adaptation contest as much as a battlefield one. The U.S. labor market sent a weaker signal in June. Job growth came in at about 57,000, well below expectations, and the unemployment rate fell, partly because around 700,000 people left the labor force. Participation dropped to roughly 61.5%, with retirements, lower immigration, and softness in lower-wage consumer sectors, all in the mix. Leisure and hospitality losing more than 60,000 jobs stands out because it suggests discretionary spending is weakening. That lands on top of an already difficult housing picture. Home prices remain far above the old affordability norm. First-time buyers have shrunk to a small share of the market, and the supply shortfall is still massive. Put together, the practical impact is pretty direct. Weaker labor force participation and expensive housing reinforce each other, making it harder for younger households to form, buy, or even plan around stable costs. One clear good news item: HPV vaccination is delivering extraordinary results. In the best-covered cohorts, cervical cancer deaths before age 30 have been nearly eliminated, which is a rare case where a public health intervention is showing exactly the kind of long-run payoff advocates promised. The counterpoint this week is heat. Extreme temperatures are forcing event cancellations, stressing electric grids, and even changing sports rules, with football authorities adding hydration breaks that now carry both safety benefits and broadcast business implications. The broader relevance is that climate stress is no longer a distant systems issue. It's showing up in health planning, grid operations, and the way major events are run right now. That's the brief for this week from Podkey Weekly News. The big pattern across these stories is institutional strain. Governments, grids, courts, and markets, all getting tested at the same time. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.